Today we're bringing us a story about the gentle voyages of Zheng He. Before we dive into it, kindly like and subscribe to our channel, but only if you enjoy what we do, and tell us where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, settle in. Let your shoulders drop. Let the day's noise drift away like sea foam receding from a quiet shore. Tonight, we travel far, to the early 15th century, to the heart of a great dynasty, to the decks of the most magnificent ships the ancient world had ever seen. We follow a man of remarkable gentleness, extraordinary courage, and boundless curiosity. His name was Zheng He, and his story is one of the most beautiful journeys ever undertaken by humankind. There is no hurry. We have all the night ahead of us. The tea is warm, the stars are out, and the ocean, as always, is patient. Imagine, if you will, the year 1368. The mighty Mongol Empire, which had ruled China for nearly a century under the name of the Yuan Dynasty, was crumbling. Its power eroded by rebellion, plague, and the slow, inevitable turning of history's great wheel. From the dust and upheaval of that transformation, a new dynasty rose. The Ming. Its name means brilliant or radiant, and it would prove worthy of that name for nearly 300 years. The founder of the Ming dynasty was Zhu Yuanzhang, a man of peasant origins who became the Hongwu emperor. He was a builder of walls, both literal and figurative, and a man who believed deeply in order, agriculture, and the self-sufficiency of the Chinese people. Under his rule, the empire turned inward, rebuilding what had been destroyed, fortifying what remained, and establishing a powerful bureaucracy rooted in Confucian ideals. The great forbidden city had not yet been built. The Grand Canal was being repaired. Millions of peasants tended their fields, their lives governed by the rhythms of rice planting and harvest, by the flooding and receding of rivers, by the slow turning of the seasons. It was a vast, ancient civilization, one of the most sophisticated on Earth, and it was finding its footing again after years of foreign rule. Into this world, around the year 1371 in Yunnan Province in the southwest of China, a boy was born. His birth name was He. He would not remain He for long. The boy from Yunnan. Yunnan was, and still is, a land of extraordinary beauty. A province of mist-draped mountains, green valleys, and dozens of distinct peoples and cultures. It was, in the early Ming period, not yet fully absorbed into the empire, a frontier region where different worlds met and mingled. He was born into a Muslim family of the Hui people, an ethnic group that had been practicing Islam in China for centuries. His father and grandfather had both made the Hajj, the great pilgrimage to Mecca, a journey of many thousands of miles that required crossing deserts, mountains, and seas. The family had Arab roots, and they spoke of distant lands with the ease of people who had heard the world described in detail. From the earliest age, young He would have been surrounded by stories of faraway places, of camel caravans crossing the deserts of Central Asia, of the holy cities of Arabia, of ports and bazaars teeming with traders from every corner of the known world. He grew up bilingual, speaking both Chinese and Arabic. He was curious, attentive, and strong. He was a child made, it seems, for travel. But his early life was interrupted by violence. When the Ming armies swept into Yunnan to complete their conquest of the region in the early 1380s, He was captured. He was perhaps 11 or 12 years old. In the custom of the time, he was castrated and taken into the imperial service as a eunuch, a fate that befell thousands of boys from conquered territories. It was a brutal beginning to what would become an extraordinary life. He was assigned to the household of Zhu Di, the Prince of Yan, the fourth son of the Hongwu Emperor, stationed in the northern city of Beijing to guard the empire's frontier against Mongol incursions. In this service, young He would find not captivity, but a kind of calling. He excelled. He was loyal, intelligent, and physically imposing. Historical records describe him as tall and broad-shouldered, with a clear voice and a commanding presence. He learned military strategy. He proved himself brave in battle, and he became, over the years, one of the most trusted companions of the Prince of Yan. When the Hongwu Emperor died in 1398 and was succeeded by his young grandson, the Jianwen Emperor, a crisis of succession erupted that would change everything. The Prince of Yan refused to submit to his nephew's authority, and a civil war began, the Jingnan Campaign, fought from 1399 to 1402. Ma He fought at his master's side throughout, and is said to have played a decisive role in a key battle near Zhengkunba in the north. When the Prince of Yan emerged victorious and became the Yongle Emperor, he rewarded his loyal companion handsomely. He gave him a new surname, Zheng, in honor of the battle where he had shown such valor. He became Zheng He, and the new emperor had very large plans for his remarkable friend. The Yongle Emperor, whose personal name was Zhu Di, was one of the most dynamic and ambitious rulers in Chinese history. He moved the imperial capital from Nanjing to Beijing, where he built the Forbidden City, that extraordinary complex of vermilion walls and golden roofs that still stands today. He commissioned the compilation of the Yongle Encyclopedia, one of the greatest collections of knowledge the world had ever seen. He restored the Grand Canal to full operation. He was, in every sense, a man who thought on the grandest of scales. He also understood something that many of his Confucian advisors did not, that China's greatness could be projected outward, not merely maintained within. He wished to establish the authority and prestige of the Ming Dynasty across the known world, to bring distant kingdoms into the Chinese tributary system, to demonstrate that the Emperor of China was the most powerful ruler on earth, and to secure the trade routes that would bring exotic goods and tribute to his court. For this purpose, he turned to Zheng He. The mission Yongle conceived was extraordinary in its ambition. A fleet of enormous ships would sail to the countries of Southeast Asia, India, Arabia, and East Africa. They would not go as conquerors. They would go as ambassadors, bearing gifts, offering trade, and demonstrating the glory of the Ming Dynasty. In return, they would receive tribute, establish diplomatic relationships, and bring back the wonders of distant lands. It was a vision of soft power on a scale the world had never seen. To carry out this vision, Zheng He needed ships. Not ordinary ships, extraordinary ones. The shipyards of Nanjing, located at a place called Longjiang, were set to work on a scale that must have seemed almost miraculous to observers at the time. The largest vessels in the fleet were called the Baochuan, the treasure ships. These were, by any measure, among the largest wooden ships ever built in human history. Historical records describe them as approximately 440 feet long and 180 feet wide. Vessels of such enormous size that a modern football field could fit comfortably on their decks. They had 9 masts carrying great red silk sails, and they were painted in brilliant colors. Red hulls, decorated with dragon motifs, their prows carved into fearsome animal shapes. The ships were like moving cities upon the sea. Modern historians have sometimes debated the precise measurements given in historical sources, as ships of that size would present extraordinary engineering challenges. But even the most conservative estimates placed the treasure ships far, far larger than anything being built in Europe at the time. When Columbus sailed to the Americas in 1492, his flagship, the Santa Maria, was perhaps 85 feet long. Zheng He's largest ships dwarfed it by a factor of 5. The fleet was not composed entirely of treasure ships. There were also horse ships, for transporting the precious animals that were sometimes carried as gifts, or trade goods, water ships, carrying fresh water for the journey, troop ships, supply ships, and combat ships for protection. A full expedition might include 200 to 300 vessels of various kinds, carrying a crew of nearly 28,000 men. Let that number settle over you as you rest. 28,000 people, sailing together across the Indian Ocean. That is not merely a voyage, it is a floating civilization. The crew of Zheng He's fleet was as remarkable as the ships themselves. There were sailors and soldiers, of course, but also doctors and pharmacists, because the Yongle Emperor understood that a fleet sailing to distant lands must be able to care for its sick. There were translators fluent in Arabic, Persian, Swahili, Malay, Tamil, and other languages of the trading world. There were astronomers to navigate by the stars. There were artisans, craftsmen who could repair the ships at sea. There were officials who handled diplomatic correspondence. There were cooks, religious leaders, and clerks. Zheng He himself was ideally suited to lead such a diverse company. As a Muslim of mixed Chinese and Arab heritage, fluent in multiple languages, he understood the cultures of both China and the Islamic world, which dominated the trade routes of the Indian Ocean. He was not merely a military commander. He was a diplomat, a navigator, and a man of deep religious faith who understood how to show respect to peoples of different beliefs and customs. When the fleet made landfall in Islamic ports, Zheng He would visit mosques and show reverence. When they arrived at Hindu kingdoms, he treated their rulers and sacred sites with equal respect. He was, in this sense, centuries ahead of his time, a man who understood that the world was large and that its many peoples deserved dignity. The first great voyage departed in the summer of 1405. Imagine the scene at the Longjiang shipyard on the banks of the Yangtze River. The great ships, newly built and gleaming, are moored in long rows, their red sails furled. The docks are alive with activity, the loading of provisions, the stowing of silk and porcelain, the supervised boarding of thousands of sailors and soldiers. The air smells of river water, pine resin, and the particular excitement of a great beginning. Zheng He would have made his prayers before sailing. As a Muslim, he prayed 5 times a day, but the prayer before a long voyage carries a different weight, a reaching toward heaven from a place of human smallness, an acknowledgement that the sea is vast and our lives are brief. The fleet moved down the Yangtze and out to the sea, gathering at the port of Lujiagang before heading south along the coast of Vietnam. Then they turned westward, following the ancient sea lanes of the Indian Ocean trade, routes that had been traveled by Arab, Indian, and Southeast Asian merchants for 1,000 years. The ocean in summer can be gentle or ferocious, depending on the monsoon. The treasure fleet was built to ride out storms, and the sheer size of the ships gave them a stability that smaller vessels lacked. But even so, a journey of thousands of miles across open water is never without danger. Typhoons, hidden reefs, disease. The sea offers no guarantees. That the fleet completed 7 such voyages with relatively few catastrophic losses speaks to the extraordinary seamanship of Zheng He and his sailors. The principal destination of the first voyage was Calicut, known today as Kozhikode, on the southwest coast of India in the state of Kerala. Calicut was one of the great trading cities of the ancient world, a place where merchants from Arabia, Persia, East Africa, Southeast Asia, and China all mingled, buying and selling spices, silk, cotton, precious stones, and countless other goods. The Zamorin, the ruler of Calicut, received Zheng He with considerable ceremony. The Chinese fleet, with its hundreds of ships and its cargo of precious gifts, was a spectacle unlike anything the port had seen before. Zheng He presented the Zamorin with silk, fine porcelain, gold and silver, and elaborate embroideries. The Zamorin, in turn, offered pepper, cinnamon, and other spices, as well as formal acknowledgement of the glory and authority of the Ming Emperor. This exchange of gifts, of respect, of diplomatic recognition, was the heart of what Zheng He's voyages were meant to accomplish. It was not trade in the ordinary merchant sense, though trade certainly occurred. It was the establishment of relationships, the weaving together of distant courts into a network of mutual acknowledgement centered on the Ming throne. Imagine sitting on the deck of one of the treasure ships in the harbor of Calicut, in the cool of the evening. The air carries the sharp, sweet smell of pepper and cardamom. The lights of the city wink along the shore. Sailors from a dozen different countries call to each other in a dozen different languages. The stars are enormous in the sky above. Orion, the Southern Cross, the brilliant arc of the Milky Way. And somewhere across the water, aboard the great flagship, Zheng He is meeting with his officers, planning the next day's diplomacy with the careful attention to detail that characterizes everything he does. It is peaceful. It is, in its way, quite beautiful. The first voyage returned to China in 1407, bringing with it ambassadors from the kingdoms visited, men who had traveled to the Yongle Emperor's court in Nanjing, bearing gifts and paying tribute. This was the formal expression of the diplomatic relationships Zheng He had established, foreign rulers acknowledging the emperor's authority, and the emperor in turn bestowing gifts and recognizing their legitimacy. It was a system of mutual face-saving, rooted in the Confucian idea that the Chinese emperor was the son of heaven, the central figure around whom all civilized order was arranged. To foreign rulers, the tribute system offered access to Chinese goods and the prestige of being recognized by the world's most powerful empire. To the Ming court, it offered the satisfying proof that China's glory was acknowledged across the known world. The Yongle Emperor was delighted. He commissioned more voyages. The second voyage, 1407 to 1409. The second voyage was briefer than the first, and its primary purpose was to return the ambassadors who had come to China, escorting them home with honor. Zheng He carried with them imperial tablets of honor, inscribed with proclamations that were to be set up in the kingdoms visited, stone witnesses to the relationships that had been formed. He also carried a special mission to Calicut to set up a stone stele, an inscribed pillar, honoring the Zamarin, and formally recording the friendship between China and Calicut. These steles were powerful symbols, the Ming equivalent of a diplomatic treaty. Several of them survive to this day. The second voyage also brought Zheng He and his fleet through the Strait of Malacca, the narrow passage between the Malay Peninsula and the island of Sumatra. This strait was, and remains, one of the most strategically important maritime passages in the world, the gateway between the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean. Control of, or at least good relations with, the kingdoms that bordered the strait was essential to the success of the treasure fleet's operations. The third voyage, 1409 to 1411, the third voyage was larger and more ambitious. It ventured deeper into the Indian Ocean, visiting more ports along the Indian coast. It was during this voyage that Zheng He encountered one of his few serious military confrontations, not as an aggressor, but as a peacekeeper. In Ceylon, present-day Sri Lanka, the king Alagonakara attempted to ambush the Chinese fleet and steal its cargo. It was a miscalculation of extraordinary proportions. Zheng He's forces, though their mission was diplomatic, were formidable. He responded to the attack decisively, capturing the king and his family and bringing them back to China. What happened next reveals much about the character of the Ming court's ambitions. Rather than punishing the Ceylonese king harshly, the Yongle emperor pardoned him and sent him home, a demonstration of imperial magnanimity that was itself a form of power. China had the strength to destroy its enemies. It chose instead to release them, and the message was not lost on watching kingdoms. Close your eyes for a moment and breathe slowly. Picture the harbor of the city of Gali on Ceylon's southern coast, a place of extraordinary beauty even today, with its old stone fort overlooking a turquoise sea. Centuries ago, Zheng He's great ships would have filled this harbor, their red sails brilliant against the sky. The air would smell of cinnamon, Ceylon's great treasure, and the sound of monks chanting in distant temples would drift down from the hills. Rest in that image for a moment. Let the cinnamon-scented air fill you with peace. With each voyage, the fleet pushed further. The fourth voyage was a watershed. For the first time, Zheng He's ships sailed all the way to the Persian Gulf and the coasts of Arabia. They visited Hormuz, the great trading city at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, a place where the riches of India, China, Central Asia, and the Arab world converged. They visited Aden, at the tip of the Arabian Peninsula, the gateway to the Red Sea, and therefore to Egypt and the Mediterranean world beyond. They may have sent envoys on to Mecca itself, though Zheng He did not make the Hajj during this voyage. The goods that came back to China on the fourth voyage filled the emperor's court with wonder, exotic animals, fine incense, strange medicines, and the extraordinary living curiosities that would capture the Chinese imagination. Most famously, a giraffe from East Africa, brought from the kingdom of Malindi. The giraffe caused a sensation in Nanjing. Chinese scholars examining this impossible creature with its impossibly long neck concluded that it must be a qilin, the mythical Chinese unicorn, a creature of good omen whose appearance heralded the reign of a virtuous emperor. The Yongle emperor received the giraffe with joy, and paintings of it were made and distributed throughout the court. It was a moment of pure, childlike wonder in the midst of all the serious diplomacy. Even emperors, it turns out, are delighted by giraffes. The fifth voyage brought the treasure fleet to the eastern coast of Africa, the furthest reach of the known maritime world as far as any Chinese ships had ventured before. They sailed along the Swahili coast, that extraordinary strip of shore where African, Arab, and later Indian civilizations had blended over centuries into a rich and sophisticated culture of their own. They visited Malindi, Mombasa, and Mogadishu, cities that were, in the early 15th century, prosperous trading centers with fine mosques, stone houses, and bustling markets. The rulers of these cities were accustomed to Arab and Indian traders, but the arrival of the Chinese treasure fleet was something different altogether, a display of wealth and power on a scale they had never imagined. Zheng He approached these kingdoms with the same diplomatic care he brought to all his visits. He brought gifts appropriate to the culture and status of each ruler. He showed respect for local customs and religious practices, and he brought back with him more ambassadors, more exotic animals, more gifts, the ever-growing network of the Ming world, stretching from China to the edge of the African continent. Think of the sailors on those ships, gazing for the first time at the African coast, the baobab trees along the shore, those ancient, bottle-shaped giants that seemed to grow upside down, the red soil, the unfamiliar birds calling in the morning light, the smell of the sea mixed with wood smoke and roasting meat from villages along the shore. Everything strange, everything new, everything, despite the strangeness, welcoming. Zheng He kept detailed records of everything he observed: the coastlines, the currents, the stars by which to navigate, the products available in each port, the customs of each people. These records, compiled by the Voyages' official historians, were a treasure of geographic knowledge that would prove invaluable to later sailors. The sixth voyage was largely a mission of escort and return, bringing home the many foreign ambassadors who had gathered at the Ming court and wished to return to their own lands. It was a measure of how wide the net of these voyages had been cast that the fleet had to divide into multiple squadrons, each heading to different parts of the world to return their respective passengers. One squadron went to the Persian Gulf, another to the Indian coast, another to the Swahili coast. Zheng He himself may not have commanded all of them personally. At this stage, he had trained other admirals in his methods, and the machinery of the treasure fleet voyages had become, in a sense, self-sustaining. But back in China, the political winds were shifting. The Yongle emperor, who had been the great patron and driving force behind the voyages, was aging. In 1424, he died. The new emperor, the Hongzhi emperor, was a man of more conservative temperament, a Confucian scholar who agreed with those officials who argued that the treasure voyages were enormously expensive and brought little practical benefit to China. He ordered the voyages suspended. For a brief moment, it seemed the great age of Chinese maritime exploration might be over. A brief pause. The Hongzhi emperor died after only 1 year on the throne. His son, the Xuande emperor, was a man of broader vision, and he would eventually authorize one final voyage. But in the years between 1424 and 1430, the treasure fleet sat idle. The great ships rested in their harbors, their red sails furled, waiting. And Zheng He, now in his 50s, a man who had spent the better part of 3 decades at sea, waited too. He remained an important official, overseeing the Nanjing area. He continued to practice his faith. He supervised the building of a mosque in Nanjing, which still stands. He was not a man who sat still easily, but he waited with the patience that the sea teaches. The final commission. In 1430, the Xuande Emperor issued the order for a seventh voyage. It would be the last, though no one knew that at the time. Zheng He, now around 60 years old, was given command once again. Whatever he may have felt about the years of waiting, he prepared the fleet with the same meticulous care he had always shown. The seventh voyage was, in many ways, the grandest of all. A farewell tour of the entire maritime world that the treasure fleet had opened up over the previous 3 decades. The fleet visited the countries of Southeast Asia, the coasts of India, the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Peninsula, and East Africa once more. It was as if Zheng He was making a final circuit of everything he had built. The relationships, the roots, the memories. At Calicut, he may have visited the steel that had been erected on the first voyage, 30 years earlier, now weathered by sun and monsoon rain, but still standing, a stone witness to the long friendship between China and this distant port. Did he run his fingers over the inscribed characters? Did he think of the young man who had first sailed into this harbor, full of the Yongle Emperor's grand vision? We do not know. The historical record is silent on such private moments. But we can imagine. The Gal steel and the voice of the Voyages. Among the most remarkable artifacts left behind by the treasure fleet voyages is the Gal trilingual inscription, a stone stele found in Sri Lanka, inscribed in 3 languages, Chinese, Persian, and Tamil. It dates to 1411, from the third voyage, and its text reveals something important about how Zheng He understood his mission. The Chinese text praises the Buddha and offers gifts from the Ming emperor to a Buddhist temple. The Persian text praises Allah and offers gifts from the Muslim Chinese to an Islamic shrine. The Tamil text praises a Hindu deity and offers gifts to a local temple. 3 religions, 3 languages, 1 stone. 3 messages that are, in their deepest meaning, the same message: we come in peace, we respect what you hold sacred, and we bring gifts. In the name of friendship, we have come from afar. This stone is perhaps the most eloquent single summary of what Zheng He's voyages were. A sustained, remarkable effort to reach across the differences of culture, language, and faith to establish relationships based on mutual respect. It was not a perfect effort. The voyages were also about power, about demonstrating Chinese supremacy, about extracting tribute. The Ming Dynasty was not a naive organization operating purely from altruism, but within the context of an age characterized by conquest, exploitation, and forced conversion. The approach embodied by the Gal stele stands out as something genuinely different. Zheng He died sometime during or shortly after the 7th voyage, in 1433 or 1435. The records are imprecise. He was buried at sea, according to some accounts, though a cenotaph tomb was built for him in Nanjing, where it stands to this day on a peaceful hillside called Bull Hill, surrounded by ancient trees. He died as he had lived, in motion between worlds, with the sound of the sea in his ears. He had been born a captive, and had become one of the most powerful men in the world. He had sailed farther than any Chinese mariner before him, visiting perhaps 37 different countries over the course of 7 great voyages. He had done it mostly without war, without conquest, without the destruction that so often accompanies the meeting of powerful civilizations with less powerful ones. He had tried again and again to show the world that China's greatness lay not in its ability to destroy, but in its ability to connect. Rest now, great admiral. The sea remembers you. After Zheng He's death, the Ming dynasty turned away from the sea. The decision was not sudden. It had been building for decades, fueled by the arguments of Confucian officials who viewed the voyages as wasteful extravagances. These men believed that the true source of China's strength was agriculture, not commerce. The cultivation of the land, not the exploration of the sea, the cultivation of virtue within the empire's borders, not the accumulation of tribute from distant barbarians. In 1436, construction of sea-going vessels was officially banned. In 1477, a powerful official named Liu Daxia is said to have destroyed the records of Zheng He's voyages, including Ma Huan's invaluable account, the Yingyashenglan, the overall survey of the ocean's shores. Some copies survived, but much was lost. The great shipyards fell silent. The treasure ships rotted at their moorings. The admirals who had learned Zheng He's methods grew old and died, and their knowledge was not passed on. Within a generation, China had withdrawn from the maritime world it had so boldly entered. It is one of history's most tantalizing what-ifs. If the treasure voyages had continued, if China had maintained its presence on the sea lanes of the Indian Ocean, and eventually pushed further south around Africa and into the Atlantic, what world might have emerged? A world first encountered by Chinese ships bearing Chinese diplomacy, and Chinese silk rather than Portuguese caravels bearing cannon and the cross? We cannot know. History does not run experiments twice. While China was dismantling its fleet, Europe was building one. Portugal, under the sponsorship of Prince Henry the Navigator and his successors, was systematically pushing its way down the coast of Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope, and into the Indian Ocean. In 1498, 65 years after Zheng He's final voyage, Vasco da Gama arrived in Calicut, the same city that had been the destination of Zheng He's first voyage. The contrast between the two arrivals could not be more stark. Da Gama came with small ships, a tiny crew, and a profound ignorance of the cultures he was entering. He brought almost nothing that the people of Calicut wanted. His gifts were considered insultingly cheap, and when diplomacy failed, he used cannon. Within decades, Portuguese warships were dominating the Indian Ocean trade routes by force, destroying the networks that Arab and Indian merchants had maintained for centuries. The age of European colonialism had begun, and the world would never be the same. Zheng He's voyages, by contrast, had left the trading networks of the Indian Ocean intact. The kingdoms he visited remained sovereign. The relationships he established were partnerships, not subordinations. The world he touched was, when he left it, still the world's own. The treasure voyages left traces wherever they went. Chinese communities established themselves in Southeast Asia during and after the voyage era. Communities whose descendants formed significant minorities in Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, and elsewhere today. The Malay language absorbed hundreds of Chinese words. The cuisines of Southeast Asia bear the imprint of Chinese cooking techniques and ingredients. Along the Swahili coast, oral traditions in some communities speak of great ships that came from the east in ancient times. In a handful of places, the island of Lamu in Kenya for instance, there are people who claim descent from Chinese sailors who came ashore and never left. Whether these claims are literally true is debated by historians, but they speak to the lasting impression the treasure fleet made on the peoples it visited. The Gal stele still stands in the National Museum of Sri Lanka, its 3 languages weathered but legible. The cenotaph of Zheng He stands on Bull Hill in Nanjing, visited by pilgrims and tourists, and in ports from Kerala to Kilwa, from Hormuz to Hangzhou. The memory of the Great Fleet drifts like sea mist through the historical consciousness of peoples who were touched by it. For centuries after the voyages ended, Zheng He was largely forgotten outside of Southeast Asia, where Chinese communities kept his memory alive. In China itself, the Confucian contempt for maritime commerce meant that his achievements were not celebrated. They were, if anything, embarrassing reminders of a period of supposed extravagance. It was not until the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as China confronted the painful reality of Western domination and sought to understand how the world had come to be arranged as it was, that Chinese intellectuals began to look back at the treasure voyages with new eyes. Here, they discovered, was evidence that China had once been the greatest maritime power on Earth and had chosen, inexplicably, to withdraw. The scholar Liang Qichao, writing in the early 20th century, was among the first to celebrate Zheng He as a national hero. He wrote that while Europeans were conquering the world, Zheng He had visited it as a friend. The contrast was meant as both a source of pride and a goad to action. China had done this before. China could be great again. In the decades since, Zheng He's reputation has only grown. In 2005, China celebrated the 600th anniversary of the first voyage with enormous fanfare, designating July 11th as China's National Maritime Day, a date that commemorates the departure of the first treasure fleet. Museums have been built, films have been made, and the name of Zheng He has become a symbol of Chinese civilization's long reach and peaceful intent. The story of Zheng He has not been without controversy. In the early 2000s, a British amateur historian named Gavin Menzies published a book arguing that Zheng He's fleet had circumnavigated the globe and reached the Americas before Columbus. This theory was embraced by a popular audience but rejected by virtually all professional historians and maritime archaeologists, who found no credible evidence to support it. The real achievement of the voyages, the sustained, peaceful diplomatic outreach across the Indian Ocean world, needs no embellishment. It is extraordinary enough on its own terms. There are also legitimate debates among historians about the nature of the tribute system, whether it was truly as benign as it appears, or whether it was a form of coercive diplomacy backed by the implicit threat of the fleet's military power. These are fair questions, and they do not have simple answers. The treasure voyages, like all great historical events, contain contradictions. But what endures across the centuries is the image of the great ships sailing peacefully into distant harbors, bearing silk and porcelain and respectful greetings, and sailing away again, leaving behind stone stales and diplomatic relationships, and the memory of something generous and grand. We live now in a world struggling to understand how great powers can and should interact with smaller nations. The question of whether power can be exercised with restraint, whether diplomacy can substitute for domination, whether the meeting of different cultures can be genuinely mutual rather than one-sided, these are among the most pressing questions of our time. Zheng He's voyages do not provide easy answers, but they provide an example, imperfect, historically specific, but genuinely remarkable, of a great power that chose, for a time, to extend its reach through gifts rather than guns, through conversation rather than conquest. That choice was eventually reversed. The ships were burned, the records destroyed, the routes abandoned, but the choice was made, and it produced something beautiful while it lasted. And beauty, even temporary beauty, matters. Let us, in this quiet hour, do something slightly different. Let us not think about history or politics or the weight of empires. Let us simply imagine what it felt like to be aboard one of those ships. You are on the deck of a treasure ship in the middle of the Indian Ocean. It is perhaps 2 a.m, and the stars are extraordinary. A river of light across the sky, the Southern Cross hanging low on the horizon, Jupiter brilliant near the zenith. The ship moves with a slow, rhythmic rise and fall that, after weeks at sea, has become as natural as breathing. The ship is enormous, but the ocean is more enormous still. You are aware, with a particular quality of awareness that only the open sea produces, of the depth below you. Thousands of feet of dark water, inhabited by creatures that have never seen sunlight, pressing up against the thin wooden hull that stands between you and the abyss. And yet you are not afraid. The ship is well built. The sailors are skilled. The admiral is wise. From somewhere in the ship below you, you can hear the sound of a flute. One of the sailors, unable to sleep, playing a tune from his home village in Yunnan Province. The melody is simple and a little melancholy, The way all music played in the middle of the ocean tends to be a thread connecting the present moment to everything left behind. You can smell the ocean, that deep, mineral smell of open water, with no land nearby to contaminate it with the smells of soil and vegetation. Pure sea. The smell of distance. The smell of the world being larger than any one person can hold in their mind. And tomorrow there will be land. The navigator has told you he can see it in the birds, in the color of the water, in the slight change in the direction of the swell. Tomorrow, a port. Tomorrow, people you have never met, speaking a language you must learn through gestures and the help of a translator. Tomorrow, new foods, new faces, new wonders. But tonight, just this, the stars and the sea, and the sound of a distant flute. The 9-masted red sail. The treasure ships had 9 masts. 9. Each mast carried a great sail of red silk or bamboo matting, and when the wind was behind them, these sails filled with a sound like a distant drumbeat, a deep, resonant pressure that you felt in your chest more than heard with your ears. The Chinese navigational tradition used a different system from the European one. Rather than latitude and longitude, Chinese navigators used a system of compass bearings combined with careful observation of stars and the depth and color of the water. The compass, invented in China centuries before, was the central tool, and the navigational charts used on the voyages, the so-called Maokun map, depicted the routes in the form of compass bearings, rather than as a bird's-eye view of the geography. This system worked. Across 30 years and 7 voyages, the treasure fleet navigated reliably from China to the Persian Gulf and the African coast, journeys of thousands of miles across open water, without the benefit of the mathematical navigation that European sailors were developing at roughly the same time. The sea does not care what system you use, as long as you use it carefully and with humility. The sea rewards attention. The sea rewards respect. Among the many remarkable people who sailed with Zheng He, one stands out as the primary voice through which we understand the voyages, Ma Huan, a Muslim Chinese interpreter and scholar who sailed on at least 3 of the 7 voyages and kept meticulous notes on everything he observed. Ma Huan's great work, the Yingye Shanglan, the overall survey of the ocean's shores, is one of the most extraordinary geographical and ethnographic texts of the medieval world. In it, he describes in vivid detail the customs, foods, clothing, religions, governments, plants, animals, and trade goods of every country the fleet visited. He writes with the curiosity and precision of a trained observer, and with the empathy of a man who genuinely finds other cultures fascinating rather than threatening. He describes the food markets of Calicut. In the market there are all manner of things to eat and drink. He describes the religious practices of the people of Aden, the daily prayers, the fasting of Ramadan, the pilgrimage to Mecca. He describes the customs of the people of East Africa with particular attention, their housing, their dress, their method of fishing, their trade in ivory and ambergris. Ma Huan was, in the truest sense, a witness, a man who understood that what he was seeing was extraordinary and who took care to record it for posterity. That his work survived, even partially, the destruction ordered by later Confucian officials is one of history's small miracles. We owe him a great deal. 2 other writers also left accounts of the voyages. Fei Xin, a soldier who sailed on 4 of the expeditions, wrote a work called Xingsha Shenglan, the overall survey of the Star Raft, that provides additional details about the countries visited. Gong Zhen, a government official, wrote a geographical account that draws on the records of the voyages to describe the countries of the Indian Ocean world. These 3 writers, Ma Huan, Fei Xin, and Gong Zhen, together constitute our primary literary sources for the treasure voyages. Their works, supplemented by the archaeological record, the stales, the Chinese porcelain found at sites along the Swahili coast, the stone anchors, and by Chinese administrative records, give us a picture of the voyages that is incomplete but extraordinary. We wish we had more. we are grateful for what we have. No account of Zheng He's voyages would be complete without dwelling on the city of Malacca, that extraordinary entrepot on the western coast of the Malay Peninsula. In the early 15th century, Malacca was a new city, founded only around 1400 by a prince from Sumatra named Parameswara, who had converted to Islam and established a trading port that quickly became one of the busiest in the world. Malacca sat at the narrowest point of the strait that bears its name, the passage through which all trade between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea must flow. Every year, with the monsoon, ships came from China and Japan in the east and from India and Arabia in the west, and in Malacca they met, traded, and waited for the winds to change direction before sailing home. Zheng He's relationship with Malacca was crucial. The young sultanate needed powerful protection against the kingdoms of Thailand that threatened it. China needed a reliable and friendly port at the strategic gateway to Southeast Asia. The two found each other, and the relationship was warm and mutually beneficial. Several of the treasure fleet's voyages used Malacca as a staging point, where the fleet could restock, repair, and conduct local trade before heading on to the Indian Ocean. The Malay language today contains hundreds of words of Chinese origin, and the Chinese community of Malaysia traces its roots in part to the era of the treasure voyages. The connection between China and the Malay world, forged in the early 15th century under the benevolent shadow of Zheng He's fleet, endures to this day. Hormuz, where the worlds met. Hormuz, at the entrance to the Persian Gulf, was in the early 15th century one of the richest cities in the world. It sat on a small barren island, almost entirely lacking in fresh water and vegetation, and yet it thrived because of its position. The gateway through which the goods of the Indian Ocean world passed into Persia, Mesopotamia, and the wider Middle East. Merchants from China, India, Arabia, Persia, Turkey, and even distant Venice and Genoa came to Hormuz to buy and sell. The bazaars were filled with Chinese porcelain, Indian cotton and spices, Persian silk and metalwork, East African ivory and gold, Arabian horses and incense. In Hormuz, the treasure fleet found a place where the entire commercial world seemed to converge. Zheng He visited Hormuz on multiple voyages, and the city's rulers sent tribute to the Chinese emperor. The gifts exchanged were magnificent on both sides. The Chinese brought silk and porcelain, the Hormuzians brought lions, leopards, and the precious horses that the Chinese always valued highly. It was a meeting of two great traditions of civilization, the Chinese and the Islamic, conducted with the elaborate courtesy that both traditions valued. Aden and the gateway to Mecca. Aden, at the tip of the Arabian Peninsula, was the last great port before the Red Sea, and the Red Sea led to Jeddah, the port of Mecca. For Zheng He, a devout Muslim, the proximity of Mecca must have been profoundly significant. He was close, in a sense, to the holiest place on earth, to the place his father and grandfather had visited on the Hajj. There is some evidence that during one of the later voyages, a delegation from the fleet did travel on to Mecca, though Zheng He himself may not have made the journey. The question of whether he made the Hajj at any point during the voyages is one of the tantalizing uncertainties of his biography. What we do know is that he built mosques, supported Islamic scholars, and maintained a deep personal faith throughout his life. In a career defined by service to a Confucian emperor and the values of the Chinese state, Zheng He's Islam was a private space that was also, in its way, a public identity. The identity that made him uniquely suited to navigate the Islamic trading world of the Indian Ocean. The lesson of the treasure voyages. We are nearing the end of our night's journey. The story has brought us far. From the mountains of Yunnan to the coral shores of East Africa, from the shipyards of Nanjing to the spice markets of Calicut, we have sailed with Zheng He across 30 years and 7 voyages, watching him build something remarkable, a web of connection, woven from silk and diplomacy, from curiosity and respect. What does this story teach us? Perhaps it teaches us that the greatest achievements of civilizations are not always the ones that last. The treasure voyages ended, The ships rotted, the records were destroyed, and yet something persists in the DNA of Chinese communities across Southeast Asia, in the memory of coastal peoples in Africa and India, in the stones inscribed with 3 languages on a hillside in Sri Lanka. Perhaps it teaches us something about the relationship between power and generosity. Zheng He had enormous power, the greatest fleet ever assembled, and he used it primarily to offer gifts. This is not a model that has been widely followed in history, but it was followed for 30 years across the width of the Indian Ocean, and it worked. Kingdoms sought the friendship of China. Ambassadors traveled thousands of miles to pay respect to the Ming emperor. The world, for a brief and extraordinary time, was drawn into a Chinese orbit, not by conquest, but by the gentle gravity of generosity. Perhaps it teaches us about the courage required to encounter difference. Every port Zheng He visited was different. A different language, a different religion, a different food, a different way of organizing the world. And rather than treating this difference as a problem to be solved or a threat to be neutralized, he treated it as a reality to be engaged, respectfully and carefully, and with genuine interest. This is the lesson of the Gal steel: 3 languages, 1 message, offered with open hands. The ocean as teacher. The ocean teaches humility. No matter how large your ship, and Zheng He's ships were large beyond anything the world had seen, the ocean is larger. No matter how many sailors you carry, the depths below you are deeper. No matter how skilled your navigation, the weather has the final word. Zheng He spent the better part of 30 years on that ocean, and it must have shaped him profoundly. The patience required by long voyages, the attention required by navigation, the care required in the management of 28,000 people across thousands of miles of sea, the humility required by the daily experience of being small in the face of something immense. These are qualities that serve a diplomat well. They are qualities that serve a human being well. And they are qualities that, in the quiet of a nighttime story, we might find worth borrowing, worth trying in our own small lives to cultivate. The ocean does not rush. It does not insist. It moves with the tides and the winds, following patterns laid down over millions of years, patient beyond our comprehension. And yet it gets where it is going. Perhaps we can too. Somewhere beneath the silted rivers and harbor beds of coastal China, the remnants of Zheng He's treasure ships lie buried. In 1982, archaeologists excavating near the old Longjiang shipyard in Nanjing found a ship's rudder post, a massive piece of hardwood 36 feet long. It was, researchers concluded, the rudder post of one of the treasure ships, and its size confirmed what the historical records had suggested. These ships were vast. That single piece of wood, 36 feet of hardwood, 500 years old, buried in river silt, is perhaps the most moving artifact of the entire treasure voyage era. It is a remnant of something enormous, now reduced to a single surviving element. But it is real. It is tangible. You could, if you visited the museum where it is displayed, reach out and touch the wood that was once part of a ship that sailed from China to Africa. Across that wood, the hands of shipwrights and sailors passed. Zheng He may have walked past it 100 times. It was shaped in the shipyards of Nanjing, carried the weight of the sea on 7 voyages, and now rests in a glass case. A bridge between the 15th century and the present. History is full of such bridges, if we have the patience to look for them. The past is not dead and gone. It is present in the surviving artifacts, in the languages and cuisines and customs of peoples touched by long-ago events, in the memories kept alive by communities who never forgot. Zheng He's voyages ended 600 years ago, and yet they are still happening, in a sense, in every port along the Indian Ocean rim, where the traces of that extraordinary encounter persist. The hour is late. Outside, whether city or countryside, the world has quieted. The traffic has thinned. The birds are silent. Even the wind, perhaps, has eased. You have traveled tonight, from 15th century China to the shores of Africa and back again. You have sailed with 28,000 sailors across the Indian Ocean on ships the size of small cities. You have watched a man of humble origins become one of the most remarkable figures in the history of exploration. You have seen the world, for a brief and shining period, approached with generosity and respect. That is not a small thing to carry to sleep. Zheng He died on the sea, probably, as he had lived, in motion between worlds with the horizon always ahead. He was buried, perhaps, in the water he loved, or perhaps on a hillside in Nanjing, beneath old trees, within the sound of bells. The treasure fleet is gone. The red silk sails have long since returned to dust. The great ships are silt and memory, but the ocean remains. It is always there, patient, immense, indifferent to empires and dynasties, to the ambitions of emperors and the calculations of officials. It was there before Zheng He sailed it, and it will be there long after the last human voice falls silent. Tonight, somewhere on that ocean, ships are moving. Container vessels as large as city blocks, carrying the goods of the modern world from port to port. And somewhere among those vessels, in the dark, a sailor stands at the bow and looks out at the stars. And the stars look back. The ocean connects us. It always has. It always will. As we come to the end of this story, remember, history doesn't whisper, it roars, and as long as you keep coming back, we'll make sure its voice is never silenced. Thank you for being here today, fellow historian. The past has more to tell us, and we'll be back to listen. Until then, stay curious, stay hungry for knowledge, and remember, history chose us to remember it.